Okay, can you hear? Online.
Yes. Okay. We can now hear online, and I'm not sure. I keep the mic on just in case that this is for the recording. All right. So everybody can hear online. So we are already one step further. That's great. Thank you for mentioning that. So after the presentation, so we'll introduce our speaker. Then we'll have a 40-minute presentation. After presentation, we will discuss the discussion prompts that I have shared with the students in the classroom yesterday. We'll also have them on the screen. I think we probably will not do the breakout room. So those online will think about the discussion prompts, and then we'll get back into the classroom to have an open Q&A. All right, with that, I would like to have the great honor to introduce Dr. Travis McLing of the Idaho National Laboratory in Idaho Falls. Dr. McLing is a Directorate Fellow and Chief Geologist at Idaho National Lab. He has more than 30 years of experience in developing, growing, and leading multi-institutional interdisciplinary research in geoscience-related fields. He has developed expertise in the field of critical minerals, geochemistry, fingerprinting of geothermal resources, and carbon sequestration. Dr. McLing has pioneered cutting-edge analysis techniques for metals, specifically rare earth elements and lithium. These capabilities are state-of-the-art and form a key foundation of Idaho's geoscience research funding. His leadership demonstrated by his ability to bring in new research capacities to INL's critical minerals, geothermal and carbon capture and storage programs establishes INL as a leader in these fields and the sole provider of complex brine and rare earth elements laboratory research in the US. Please help me welcome Dr. McLing.
Want to use the microphone? So I have a friend who always says he's a cross between a preacher and a truck driver, and he can't hold still while he talks. And I have the same problem. So if folks online have difficulties, please make it known so I can change what I'm doing here. So it's always interesting to have to give a bio. So I'm in my 37th year as being a practicing geoscientist. And so I've done a lot of fun stuff over my career, but really I'm a grandpa and a fly fisherman with a geology problem. And so I do this geology thing so I can get out on the river and get on my horse and enjoy life around. Today we're going to talk about a subject that's pretty timely right now, and it's an area of great concern all over the Western world, and it's that sourcing of metals and the energy transition. And I'm going to, hopefully through the talk today, we're going to have an opportunity to get you to think about some things that are a little different than how you've normally thought about things. Now, there's Edward Lorenz in the 1970s coined a phrase associated with his research, and he was a mathematician and meteorologist. And he had a phrase. First, originally, the statement was, if a seagull flaps its wings, does it create a tornado in Kansas? Well, some people said that's not very elegant, so we changed it to, if a butterfly flaps its wings, does it create a tornado in Kansas? And what I'm talking about today really is if somebody opens up their cell phone and uses it in Boise, Idaho, does a poor black kid die in the Congo? And this is one of those consequences of our great opportunities that we have today, is that we are fostering and sourcing our technology advances on the backs of poor people all across the world. And as a result of that, we are also setting up a single entity in the global marketplace as having dominance over the rest of the countries in the world. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And I hope that in the end, I am not the arbiter of all things that are, I don't know the answers, but I do know a lot of the questions, and hopefully have a chance for you with your diverse background to be able to think about these in a little different perspective as we go through it today. Are we having difficulty?
I just want to check which slide people are seeing when they're logged in. Strength. Okay, so we seem to be.
We are not seeing the right one. So strength and local partnerships. So are we? What? I can't hear.
Slide number 7.
Slide number 7. All right, this is technically is a little bit more difficult than we had originally had planned. And again, I'm not a practicer of Zoom.
So you're good there. So it's not on your end.
Yeah.
But we
So
should,
hold on. Let me. So I'm going to.
this is the one that's tracking. So I think if you hit.
Yeah. So this is the wrong one. I need to turn. So I'm gonna have to stop sharing. Excuse me for a moment. I'm gonna stop sharing. I'll start restart. I'm just gonna close all my windows. No. We've got to get this right here. I'm gonna close all my windows so that I can pull up the right one. All right. So if I go to Zoom now, I can go to share.
Yeah.
Share, should be share. Okay, share here. I should be able to choose that one. And I should be able to share that one. Can you see it now? All right. I got to tell you.
Make this just that little bar there.
Yeah, we'll go down here. I'll put this into display mode. We should be back in the saddle again. Again, at where I'm at, I can see that just messed it up. I can mess up in about all of the. Okay, how are we? Are we seeing it? Okay,
Thanks.
all right. Thank you for getting that squared away. Now, if the slides will advance. We're gonna make this work. All right. So a book I read a few years ago that was really I often tell people I'm not a very emotional guy. My grandkids do something cute, I get pretty emotional about that, but otherwise I'm not a very emotional guy. When I was about 8 years old, I read a book called Old Yeller and I cried like a baby. I don't know if any of you ever read Old Yeller, but if you ever read it, it's a pretty sad story about a guy and his dog, and I have bird dogs, and it was sad for me. And then I read Cobalt Red a few years ago, and Cobalt Red made me sad because it really opened up the inside, the ugly underside of what's happening in the technology world and the sourcing of metals necessary for our energy transition, our technological advances, and the position we find ourselves globally. Now, if you think about this, about 8 billion people on the earth today. About 1 billion of those people live a pretty nice standard of living. 7 billion people live well below the poverty level. Okay, so there's 1 billion people who share in about 98% of all the global economic return. All right, and of those 1 billion people, there's probably about 700 million of them that live in the very upper echelons of that. So the rest of the world, in large part, lives well below our standard of living. They all want to get to our standard of living, but they live well below it. And we oftentimes do things that we think are a really good idea, but have negative consequences elsewhere. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. If you have not read, so typically when I have a discussion with folks and I say, all right, we're having a conversation, I'm going to teach a class on metals and their role in the energy and technology evolution, I make them read a few books. One of the books is the War Below, Lithium Economy, Cobalt Red, The Chips War. Those are some of the base books that you have to read before we start having a conversation on common ground. If you haven't read Cobalt Red, you really need to put that high on your list of books to read. In about 1996, when the Clinton administration came along, they were looking for cost-cutting avenues, as administrations always are. And one of the things they looked at and said, well, go back a little bit. What time do we have to end, by the way?
5 minutes since we were late, so that would be about 50.
Okay, all right. I'm going to have to really cover some ground here. So I started out my geoscience career wanting to be an ore deposits geologist. I really loved the whole story about how petrogenesis of ore deposits, how you find them, how you exploit them, the cool minerals that are associated with them. But in the early 1990s and late 1980s, I was a young dad, had some children. I was an undergrad, and it became pretty clear to me that it was not a pathway at the depressed metal prices that we were experiencing at the time. I was going to have to raise my children in the former Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, where I was going to have to move them to some mine in the Atacama Desert in South America. And so I decided that, well, the physics are all the same. I decided to be a nuclear waste cleanup guy. And so I came to the National Lab System to work on cleaning up what I call the sins of our fathers, the things that we did post the development of the atom bomb through the Cold War. There's a lot of big messes. So I came into the system and I started working on that. So the very first projects I worked on were associated with cleaning up of mine tailings, cleaning up of nuclear waste material, cleaning up of organic solvents. So, but you got to remember, by the 1990s, we had moved in this transition of, we were trying to clean up the environment. We were trying to make things better for our children. And mining had left a pretty horrible legacy of scarred earth all around the globe and in the United States. If you hike a lot, you can still see some of those scars today. And so in 1996, it seemed like a logical thing to do is to get rid of the Bureau of Mines. Now, the Bureau of Mines had been around for many decades, and it was an intellectual powerhouse. So it produced a lot of patents on mining and development of technology associated with mining and how to do mining in a better way, a more efficient way. But in 96, it seemed like the United States, we just weren't interested in mining anymore. It was a scar, a blight on the landscape. Metal prices were really low. So that's why we can save some money. We'll get rid of the Bureau of Mines. So we did. We got rid of the Bureau of Mines in 96. China took a look at that and said, oh, you foolish ones. So they took the IP, the intellectual property from the Bureau of Mines, and they took it to China with them. Processing of rare earth elements was one of those pieces of IP. And they began the process of developing a minerals minerals economy, even though there was no money to be made from it at the time. And so they started this 30-year rush that we're now going into the fourth decade of becoming the mineral powerhouse of the world, because they had the long view. In our country, we have a long view of 4 years and then maybe another 4 years, but we think on very short terms, whether we're talking about capital investment or whether we're talking about political investment. The Chinese said, no, 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 one of these days, they saw the future. One of these days, these are going to be important. And so they started developing those technologies. Oh, by the way, which were our technologies. They belonged to us and we gave them away. So since 1996, we have not had a formal mechanism in this country and in large part in the Western world, to develop resources and do things in a better, cleaner, faster, more efficient manner. So that started our problem clear back in 1996. I even had hair in 1996. That's how long ago it was. So there's a move now today. People are thinking about, maybe we should bring back the Bureau of Mines. And this is kind of the mosh pit of federal organizations now that think that they own mining. So literally every federal organization, well, it's not literally, I guess, nearly everyone, all of the DOE program offices think they own minerals. Department of Defense think they own minerals. Department of Interior thinks they own minerals, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really hard to figure out who owns the Bureau of Mines if they do a reconfiguration. But it's kind of funny. It's like jumping in a kilometer-long race when the rest of the team has already run 3/4 of the race, right? We're that far behind. So there's anxieties around I don't know how that apostrophe got in there, but anxieties around the U.S. dependence on foreign critical minerals has been a big deal for the last few years. And it became a really big deal back in 2012. In 2012, the Chinese and the Japanese got into a feud over some islands in the South China Sea, or in the Sea of Japan, excuse me. And Japan's on those islands. They said, we're not giving them up. China says, we own those islands. Japan says, no, you don't. They said, all right, I tell you what we're going to do. No more rare earths for you. And they cut them off. And they suddenly went, holy cow, we have no other resource. We have no other place to get these critical elements. So Japan worked through their difficulties and were able to resource, and they decided so now they have a big domestic stockpile. So they have actually a pile of rare earths, and they began looking at other places to start sourcing. The United States said, wow, that's a problem. And then they went on about their business and didn't really address it in any meaningful way. But each year that problem has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, because I should have a jar. Every time I say critical, I need to put $1 in it because it is critical to our future, where these metals come from. Imagine, if you will, if China decides tomorrow or next week or next year that we're going to just go ahead and take Taiwan. We wanted it since the end of World War II. We're done. We're going to take it. What could we do about it? Well, we can throw aircraft carriers and everything into it, but they just simply cut off our metal supply. And we can't build missiles. We can't build fighter planes. We can't build submarines. We can't build warfighting equipment. We can't build encrypted messaging and communications. In the end, we probably have to say, yeah, I guess Taiwan wasn't that important to us after all. That's not a good position to be for a global superpower. So this is I have a few statements here that I think are worth reading. So let me talk this. Share this with you. If we're going to cover the volume and range of critical minerals needs industry requires, we need stronger public-private partnerships and more agile friendshoring. You must look at the end-to-end supply chain from start to finish, from extraction to refining, and increasingly through recycling. Those two dimensions and commercial investment and the foreign policy needed to better integrate. Otherwise, US and Western manufacturers are going to start feeling an even greater pinch in the next few years. So that statement was made back in 2017, and it's even become more and more of an issue today. We do recognize that it's unlikely that the US can ever source all of its metals it needs domestically, but through close friends and trusted countries that we can probably do that, and that's called friendshoring, if you will. So here's the crux of the big problem. I talked about the offshoring of US capability in 1996. So if you look at this list, there's an estimated need, this is from 2023, there's an estimated need of almost $35 billion in investments in order to get us to a place where we need to be with respect to metals, metal refining, and the supply chain security. Historically, those investments have been about $4 billion total. Okay, so we're way behind. Not only are we behind technologically, but we're not even spending enough money to keep us behind. Right now, we're getting further behind. So those investments are not only not helping us; they're actually putting us in a worse position. One of the points I want to make here today, as we go through the process, everybody talks about critical minerals or critical strategic minerals, and you think, wow, those things must be very expensive. They're not. They're marketed by the kilogram. Some of them have values of a few tens of dollars per kilogram. If you're talking about rare earths, some of them they're worth a few $100s per kilogram. But they don't cost very much, right? They don't have the high value that say gold or silver has, right? They're actually very cheap, and they're considered industrial metals. So it takes a lot of resource to make. So you got to move a lot of rock to make a kilogram of rare earth oxide. Okay, so that's something you need to understand in the grand scheme of things like copper it's not a critical mineral, but it's not a near critical mineral. It is the most important metal going forward. So just if we just did a transition and to electric cars in the United States, we would increase by over an order of magnitude the need for copper. That would mean we'd have to open a Kennecott. Have you ever seen Kennecott, Bingham Pit down in Salt Lake? It's called the richest hole on earth, been mining it for 100 years. You would have to open up a Kennecott-sized pit. You'd have to open up 5 of those every single year just to meet the demand that's projected through 2050. 5 a year. We're not even starting 1 a year. So we can talk about critical minerals. We can talk about dysprosium and neodymium and europium and cobalt and lithium. And let's just talk about copper, for crying out loud. We're not even going to get there with copper. So we're in a bit of trouble. But if you look at, say, copper, which is in the pink here, I don't know what color it shows up on your screen, but it's pink in mine, or my wife. I'm a generalist, so there's 5 basic colors. To me, that's pink. So you can see what the market share is on the global production volume, 3.6 million metric tons for copper, and it has about a $4.42 billion market cap. So that's about what the copper minerals are worth. If you take a look at something like cobalt, 17 billion. Okay, so only $17 billion worth of cobalt is put on the market every single year. 17 billion. Okay, it's a trivial amount of money compared to the global GDP. So not a lot of value, but very important technologically. So you got to have a handle on it. That's what I'll go back to this again and again and again whenever I talk about this subject, is that the problem we have with metals and our sourcing of metals is financial. If there was $1 to be made, we would be mining them today. Okay, but they're not. They don't have incredibly high value. Opening up a mine costs you $3 billion a year and takes 20 years. There's no company that's right mind is going to leverage $3 billion of its discretionary funds to put at risk something that perhaps in 20 years may not be of value. Go back 20 years ago, rare earths and lithium had hardly any value. Now they have a lot of value relatively. What do they look like in 20 years when new technology comes along? Or can China simply do as it did with cobalt in the cobalt mine in Idaho a couple years ago, simply floor the price? They just put enough metal out of the market to crash the price and made them non-profitable, and they had to put their mine into idle status. So why would you put at risk your investments if in the end a single entity can end up bankrupting you? So those are decisions that are being made on a daily basis. But when you look on the thing on the right, on the slide on the right there, on the market size, 2.3 billion, 2 billion, these are trivial in a global marketplace. There's not a lot of huge dollars to be made out there in the first place. Another important part about this is that I said before, it takes about 14 to 20 years to open up a mine, depending on how close you are, say, to Sun Valley versus to Chalice, right? If you're closer to Chalice, you can probably open a mine on the shorter end of that time frame. If you're near Sun Valley, you're probably going to be further out than 20 years, right? Because it's just that people have a lot more money and lawyers to go after you. But the real important part about this is if you take a look at the timeline, permitting, which is the real problem you have here, and that's where all the legalities come into place, is it takes place at the critical juncture, at the 5-year range in the process, at the most vulnerable position. And so you're either going to get a permit or you're not going to permit, but you've already invested a lot of money into it and you have a lot of capital on the line. And so you're right on the wire of falling one way or another. So there's a valley of death. We hear about it in the TRL space, but there's also a valley of death when it comes to opening up a new mine. So that's an important thing to consider, is where that permitting process takes place and what it costs you to get through that process, through the litigation. Because your investors, remember, they want a return on their investment. If it's going to take you 7 years to litigate the process, your investors are going to pull back and pull away. So this is a really good example. So I followed this very closely. This is Indonesia. So Indonesia 2 years ago passed a law, and this law was passed as a result of some pressures that were put on it by China. And essentially it said Indonesia is a huge supplier of nickel into the global market. And so they used to sell it everywhere. So they would take the raw product and they would ship it all over the world, and it would be processed into the final product. Then they got with China and they said, hey, you know what? We're going to pass a law in Indonesia that no nickel can leave Indonesia if it's not as a refined product. So it's 99.9% pure. It can't leave the country. So that means it's going to be all of that money is going to be left in the country, and it's not going to go outside the country unless it's in a refined product or in a widget. And if you take a look at what between 2005 and 2008, you look at investments in Indonesia in the mineral sector, and you can see things were there. China was there, the UK was there, India was there. Then you look at 2009 through 2012. Now remember what happened in 2012. That's why the big blue dots, the big blue band is there. It's the Japanese started investing heavily. And then you look at 2013 through 2016. That's when it happened, the point I just talked about, where the Chinese began to exert their influence on the metals market. And you can see that China dominated investments. They started buying up the resources in Indonesia. And that's when they began having the influence on the government and said, tell you what we're going to do. We're going to keep all of the material in country, and you're going to process it here and keep the resources here. And then we're able to control that spigot, right? So if you're a nickel mine in northern Minnesota and you want to start up a mine, you say, okay, we got all this nickel selling at this price. We can make money doing that. And you go ahead and go through all the processes. Then you get ready to go into production. They just open up the spigot a little bit more and put 10% more on the market. It craters the price by 50%. And then you're left with a bankrupt investment. And then if you look at today, so this is only up through 2019, it's essentially Japan and China that are investing in Indonesia. And we're seeing this more and more across the global landscape. So this is really the crux of the problem that I've just been talking about. A single entity. So if you look, 96.5 of all the rare earth production in the world goes through China. It's either mined, processed. The US produces about 3% of the global rare earth supply, but every molecule of ore that we mine in Mountain Pass, California, goes to China and is processed and then is sold back to us. Okay. Even copper. We are the world's second largest exporter of copper. We don't refine our own copper in this country. It goes on a ship and it goes to China and is processed and then sold back to us. Graphite. So this right here, this is for rare earths, but this is true for all of the metals that we think about in terms of the things that fire up that we use for our cell phones, for our iPads, for our Teslas, for whatever the case may be. So in mining, you look at that, 67% of all the mining, that's their market share. 67% of all mining. That's crazy. Rare earth oxides, 88%. Rare earth metals, that means the refined product, 92%. Alloys and powders, 91%. And then neodymium iron magnets are being made 89%. All of the graphite anodes for like car batteries, Tesla batteries, and et cetera, all of the graphite anodes come out of China. Every single one of them. Doesn't matter where it's mined, it goes to China, is refined and made into the anodes that then is used to power industry. So we are powering our industry on the backs of buying all of these metals from a foreign entity. It's not healthy in any respect to have a single source for as many of these metals as we have. It didn't matter whether if it was the UK or if it was us. Being the only source or the only producer is not healthy for the global market. I talked to you about in 2013, in 1996, when we lost the Bureau of Mines, that China got pretty wise and decided to start investing. And then in 2013, China started its Belt and Road Initiative. And that initiative was about establishing global trade and becoming the only source for materials. And essentially what China wanted to do is kind of reestablish the old Silk Road, which was they wanted to be able to the source for all the materials. And when you think about the Belt and Road Initiative, you think, well, that's pretty clever. They're going to make a lot of money out of it. But they never did the Belt and Road Initiative to make money. It was not about making money. As it said back there, China is not looking for internal rate of return profitability. They are seeking broader strategic goals, making China and Western investors pursuing different goals. It puts them on an uneven playing field. Okay, so it doesn't matter. So China has these policies in place. So if you're going to mine copper, you are forced by law to recover every other metal in that ore deposit. So if you're a US producer, you make your money on copper, you refine your process so that you get copper out highly efficiently and all the rest of the materials go to a waste pile. In China, you are forced by law to take out the gallium, the gadolinium, the antimony, the mercury, the silver, et cetera, through the process. That's part of their integration program, right? So even with gallium, gadolinium, and antimony, which you saw just at Christmas time, China just closed off. They're the only sources in the world for those materials. They closed off the supply chain, okay? No more antimony, no more gadolinium, no more gallium. So no more wide band gap resistors, no way to harden metals for, say, defense purposes, gone, because we don't produce it in the country, all right? So it's about exerting influence. They're making plenty of money, but they don't really care about money. They are stockpiling more cobalt in a big pile in China than the Jervois mine in central Idaho would have produced over its whole life cycle in 1 year. So it's not about making money for them. It's about this influence. And so that's when you see this on the news, you think, oh, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that it's unfair practices, and it puts us on an uneven playing field. If the United States produces a metal and it's at market price, we're still at risk, right? Because they can lower the price and we can be out of business. If we produce a metal because and people always say, well, we do it better, more environmentally safe, we have better jobs, we have better safety records. So we produce these metals at a higher price. There isn't any more, metals are fungible. That means that if it's produced in Australia or in the United States or China, it goes into a global pot and it's sold at that spot price. We don't have the luxury of being able to charge 10% more because it's clean, or it has we can demonstrate the supply chain is free from, say, indentured labor and things like that on it. I think I'll skip by that one. This is talked about what I just said before is the integration. So China pulls all of its metals out of its refining process, not just the one that makes the most money. With respect to why don't we do it here in the US, market instability remains the most important factor inhibiting domestic production. While permitting reforms remain pressing issues, Western countries face two additional challenges. First, a lack of experimental knowledge compared to those who have learned how to operate and optimize processes and facilities through a willingness to operate at subscale at a loss. We are not in the business in a capitalist-driven world to be able to do that, right? We do not do things at a loss. Second, inability to compete with the willingness of others to use some more labor-intensive and less sophisticated technologies to solve operational challenges. Go online sometime, go on Google Earth and go to Bayan-Obo, world's largest rare earth deposit, and take a look at Bayan-Obo just from the sky. It is a wasteland. It is contaminated to a degree that we would never accept in this country. And it's heavily labor-intensive. They hurt a lot of people. They've ruined the environment, but they're producing rare earths at a price that nobody else can compete with, right? And so we would never stand for that in this country. So our inability to be able to address those kind of problems. So we have to come up with some sort of technologies that produce things 10 times cheaper, right? And that's hard. That's a big, you got to jump the shark on that. To get something that's 10% cheaper or 10% more efficient, that's a big push. So when this became a real problem, the problem came to a head really when we talked about military. So if you take a look at our F-35 fighters or F-22 fighters or our missiles, the Patriot missile, whatever, they use quite a bit of these rare earth and these other kinds of critical minerals in that production. So this is based on NATO, and I do some work with NATO as well. So this is the NATO supply chain risk. My grid is cut off down here on the bottom. My legend is cut off. You can see stuff in red are highly at risk, and things in green are not so highly at risk. But you can see the kind of things, if you're going to put a fighter aircraft in place, you can see what kind of metals are needed and which ones are the ones that are difficult to get and which ones are the ones most at risk. Since we don't produce any rare earths, and we require rare earths in our fighter planes and in our high-tech weaponry, we buy them so we're forbidden by law to buy them from China. So the workaround is that we buy them from a third party. So a third party buys them, and then we buy them from that third party and say, well, we don't care where it came from. All I know is I bought it from them, and they're nice guys. So we found a way to circumvent that. Well, there's a new law was passed in 2024 under the Biden administration. It's going to make that even more difficult. So we're not even going to be able to source them through, the guy on the street, right, that says, hey, you want to buy a watch kind of thing. We're not going to be able to do that as easily anymore. So there's going to be a forcing. Regardless of our goals there, we're not going to start mining this stuff tomorrow. It takes a long time to get that. So we're still going to have to figure out a way to get those materials. And ultimately, they're still going to come from the PRC. There's just no other way to get around that. So I talked about rare earths and other critical minerals they're important, but they're not valuable. They're valuable because of what they do, but they're not valuable in terms of like nobody's going to stockpile a bunch of rare earths in their garage, right? It's not happening, Or you do copper, or you do some gold, and you do some platinum, and you do some silver in your safe, and you buy that as a hedge against inflation. But you don't do that with rare earths because the kind of building you'd have to put 100 metric tons of rare earths in the building to have any kind of market, to have any kind of hedge against inflation is just too ridiculous. So here's an example. So an F-35, our top of the line fighter plane, takes about 920 pounds of combined rare earths to make. An Arleigh Burke class destroyer or guided missile ship takes about 5,200. An example I have here, so the new Virginia class attack submarine in the US takes 9,200 pounds of critical minerals, okay? So I did a calculation. I said, okay, let's assume it's all dysprosium, because dysprosium is right on the upper edge of the highest priced rare earths. So it's got a value of about $400 a kilogram. So if all of that critical mineral was, or that rare earth was dysprosium. It's about $3 million worth of rare earths to go into making a Virginia class submarine. $3 million. It's nothing. It's out of a machine that costs $3.5 billion to make. It's only about 0.015% of the total cost. Yet you can't have it without it. So this is where the big disconnect comes from, is that terribly important, but not very valuable. Let me go back. So I missed something which I usually start off with. So when we talk about, I've got a slide coming up in the first, and I'll talk about why these things don't have really high value, but they're technically important for technology. So depends on who you talk to. So if you talk to NATO, they have a list of critical minerals. If you talk to the Department of Energy, they have a list. The Department of Energy's metals called the Electric 18. The USGS has 58 that fall on that list. The Department of Defense has these. This is just a nice little graph that I made that shows how they overlap. So some of them are common, some of them are not common. So quartz is important to DOD, but it's not important to any of the other offices. Carbon fibers, important to DOD, but not important to the rest of the global marketplace. However, flake graphite for anodes is really important, but it's not important for DOD. So these things, they kind of float around in this space depending on who you're talking to. But a few of them do overlap and are important to all three of the entities. I'm just going to skip over that one. So here's where we get to the point. So we call these, and we talk a lot about rare earths because they're convenient and they're really kind of interesting. I did my PhD on rare earths, so I like to talk about them. But there's a whole bunch of these other metals out there that are interesting. Rare earths are pretty interesting. They have an interesting name. They're called rare earths. They're not called rare earths because they're hard or they're not in abundance. They have about the same kind of global abundance in rocks as about copper does. So they're about as common as copper. And when you talk about it, so there's a little slide, there's a little corner down there. It'll show you rock forming elements. You'll see that rare earths there in the blue, they're about the same as copper, about the same as tin, et cetera. So they're not uncommon. Rare earths are everywhere. One of the things about the rare earths is that even though they're widely distributed in the Earth's crust, the processes that bring them together in ore bodies that are rich enough to be mined are very difficult. These are rocks that are really interesting. They're largely called carbonatites. These are volcanic carbonates. Now, if you don't, you're not a geologist, but volcanic carbonate. Imagine, well, these are really pasty, gooey lavas that when I was going to school, the only place I ever knew that they came from was East Africa Rift. And turns out there's a lot of carbonatites. We have some in Idaho that I've been studying in recent years, and they're pretty interesting. I never thought I'd lay my hand on a carbonatite. It turns out I find them everywhere. But those processes that allow for the rare earths to be concentrated because they're so vanishingly insoluble and not very mobile, they only occur in a very specific type of geologic environment. And these carbonatite systems are one of them. And then the other part, which really is, we believe, is where the rare earth came from, is that because there's these lanthanum through lutetium, these elements here, they all have the same charge, very similar ionic radii, and they have very similar chemical properties. So separating lanthanum, which doesn't have very much value, is only good for really polishing screens and stuff like that, from something like europium, is very difficult. The chemical process is exceedingly difficult, and that's why they do it in China, not in the US. So the rare comes from that. It's rare that to find a process that can separate those into their metals is very difficult. And so we think that's where the name rare earth came from. It gets a lot of attention because those of us who study these metals, people think, wow, rare earths, you're pretty cool. But really, they're just rocks, there's minerals. But separations, one of the things I've done is developed a technology that allows us to separate these metals for analysis and characterizing of the surface. And it takes me on average about 8 hours to process a sample to be able to get it to the point where I can do the analysis. So it's not all that easy to play with them, but that's it. They're not rare. They're not expensive. I mean, think about lithium for a minute. So we're all searching for lithium, right? Lithium's number 3 on the periodic chart. Right? And generally abundance increases the closer you get, right? Hydrogen, the most abundant. right? And you get down to the far end of the like uranium, not very abundant, is that lithium's number 3 on the periodic. It's everywhere. Lithium is freaking everywhere. But it has these weird chemical properties, right? It's sticky, and it's fairly hard to mine because of its chemical property. But it's not rare by any stretch of the imagination. It is everywhere. All minerals have some lithium in them, but do they have enough lithium in them to make it worth mining? That's the big question. So we have to. So this is the conundrum, right? Is that this gold, vanishingly difficult to find, because concentrate, the processes that concentrate gold are very specific. Copper, really common. So there's this idea that the value versus abundance are correlated here. So, boy, I'm getting close. I'm going to finish this up really quick. We mine today just about like we mined 4,500 years ago in the Bronze Age, right? Only we use, back in those days, you went to a place where there was ore, you took a rock and you beat that rock on another rock and you broke the rock up and you put it into a little kind of backpacky thing and you walked it to a fire, you put it in a fire, you burnt it and roasted it until it melted, and then you've got some copper and you were able to make a spear point or something with it, right? So it's very similar to what we did back in those days, only we use way sexier equipment. Bigger trucks, bigger crushers, bigger separators, bigger processing. But you think about it, we still go to a rock phase. We break the rock, we haul the rock, we crush the rock, we heat the rock. Very similar process of what we did all those, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. But in that process, we've created over 6 cubic kilometers of waste material associated with our mining processes over the past 4,000 years. And that's growing each and every day. So we have to figure out a way to, if we're ever going to make mining popular or acceptable by the public, we're going to have to figure out a way to handle the tailing piles so we don't have a blight on the surface. But I have 5 minutes. One of the reasons why we shipped our resources for rare earth processing off of the continent and let China take that IP, by the way, they didn't pay anything for it. They just took it because we gave it to them, is because rare earth, same processes that enrich rare earth elements also enrich thorium. So typically when you have a weight % rare earth oxide, you have a weight % thorium oxide. So being able to handle these ores, you have to be able to handle. That's why our Mountain Pass mine went bankrupt twice, is because the byproduct of the mining created a thorium enriched solution called NORM, naturally occurring radioactive materials. And so they had a few leaks on their pipelines that distributed these the wet slurries out to the tailings piles, and of course they got shut down because of it. So one of the things that we're doing here in Idaho is we're developing capabilities to be able to work with these naturally occurring radioactive elements. These things have less radioactivity than that banana right there. Right? If I took a Geiger counter right now and I put it against a rare earth oxide ore and I put it against that banana, the banana would be about 4 times hotter, have 4 times more decay than the rare earth. But nevertheless, by regulation and statute, we have to deal with this as a waste material. So that's one of the things we have to do. We didn't want to do it. We weren't into that. And so the Chinese figured out a way to do that and take advantage of it. I'm going to skip through all of these. This is you'll see that one of the areas where we're building special capability, Idaho National Laboratory with Idaho State University, is in being able to process and demonstrate new technologies for recovering critical minerals and not having to deal with the arsenic and the mercury and the norm, or the radioactive elements that are associated with them, finding safer ways to dispose of and handle them. Idaho is rich in critical minerals. In fact, from my office, I always say from a half day's drive, I can take you to 13 world-class deposits of critical elements, from rare earths, cobalt, antimony, you name it. They're right here in our backyard. One of the biggest deposits in the entire world is just south of here for lithium. It's Nevada Lithium has their Thacker Pass mine complex that they're going to start producing. It'll be the world's largest lithium deposit if they can get it permitted. All right. So we have a lot. All the dots here show our rare earth deposits up along the Salmon River area, along the Idaho-Montana border, and then just to the south and west, you'll see that there's also the cobalt deposit. If you go a little bit further west, you'll see our antimony deposit. So Idaho is rich. We have this incredible geologic history. We had a whole bunch of intrusions of deep mantle material that came up into the subsurface of the near surface and have since been weathered away and left us with this. That's why I practice geology in Idaho, is that you see kinds of things that you don't get to see everywhere else. This is just a picture. So if you want to know what a rare earth deposit looks like, this is a deposit we're working on for a company in southwestern Montana. The pink you see there are actually carbonatites. So these are the highest value, highest concentrated rare earth ores that we've ever measured anywhere in the globe. So those pink parts there are carbonatites. That means they have about 20 weight percent. So they're 1/5 rare earth oxide. Richest deposits by far that we've ever found. How do you mine them in that complex geology? That's the question for down the road. There are lots of gaps in it. So if we propose that we're going to go into the business of mining like they do in China, we'll never achieve public acceptance. We'll never be able to get there. So we have to do it in a better, more benign fashion. How do we do that? We develop new technologies. We move less material. We mine higher grades, and we don't have such big tailings piles and such potential problems for later on, including acid mine drainage and other kinds of things. So we have to develop technologies that allow us to process those ores in a better fashion, even to the extent, I was gonna show you, even to the extent where we don't even mine we don't even bring the ore to the surface anymore. We're working on projects now that what's called remote mining or no human entry mining, where we actually use remote operated vehicles and technology to go into the ground, mobilize the metals and bring them to the surface. We don't have to move the rock at all. That's still way out in front of the headlights, but we have projects going on right now. And so this fits in, those of you who are interested in cyber protections. So if you're a foreign actor and you're worried about the US becoming big players in metals and they're doing a bunch of stuff robotically or with autonomous operations, what you do is you go on and you do some hacking and you get them to shut down so all the stuff drives into a pit and dies, right, and kills itself. So you got to have protection. So this isn't just a mining problem. This becomes a technology protection problem too. So I think there's a lot of room for everybody to play in this area. And then, as I said before, we just have to reduce the amount of waste material we have. One of those things we're working on currently is the ability to go into old mine tailings and process those mine tailings that have already been mined and are already a blight on the surface. Take those materials, reprocess them, take the waste, put it in a more safe, more aesthetic manner, pull the metals out that are, because they're interest to us from an economy point of view, but they're also a detriment to the fisheries and wildlife there, is to take those metals, put them into the marketplace, and then put the land back to a near original state. So we're looking at those, and there's a lot of potential there, but they're regulatorily difficult to deal with. I can't go into those mine tailings, and I can't even take a shovelful of them to do a test on because they're regulatorily bound with agreements. So the Bevel Act and the CERCLA and some of the other laws will not allow me to go in and play with those tailings. What's interesting is if you take a look at copper, the grade of copper we're mining globally right now is less than the amount of copper that's in the tailings piles surrounding these old mines. So we're mining at about 0.2% copper in these big, rich copper mines, but the tailing piles have like 0.5%, right? So they're almost 2 times more concentrated in the tailings piles than they are in the mine. Why don't we just go back and start mining those tailings piles, and then we can clean them up and everything? Well, we can't, because they've got signed agreements with the state, with the federal government, sometimes with the tribes. And unless we have a major change in political policy, then we won't be able to access those. It seems like a no-brainer, right? Let's not build a new hole. Let's take the old hole and reprocess the stuff and clean it up so you can mountain bike on it. I can ride my horses on it and take my family fishing on it, right? Well, it seemed like a no-brainer, but when you're talking about federal policy, there's nothing that's a no-brainer. I'm almost done here. So this is our project I was going to close with right now and leave you with the last thing. Then I'll go to the last slide that you had there. So this is our idea of what we call in situ mining. So I'm currently working on a project, a very large project. We're doing in situ recovery of uranium in Wyoming. So this uranium is in about 100 meters below land surface. It's in these sediments down there. And so they're using these well controls. They put in a central well They put in injection wells and they flood carbon dioxide and oxygen through them. It mobilizes the uranium. They pull that uranium to the surface. They pull it out through some filtering processes, and then they take that uranium oxide as yellow cake and they sell it off into the uranium market. Then when they're done, they plug up the wells, they clean up the site, replant the sagebrush, and away they go and move on. And so we're working with them, but currently they're leaving about 40% of that uranium in the subsurface. And so one of our problems is to come in there. One of our challenges is to go in there and help them do a more efficient recovery of the uranium in situ. So in this case, they're not moving rock anywhere. They're just going into the subsurface. They're mobilizing the uranium, recovering it, and they have monitoring wells around the thing, so they have no excursions. So they're regulated, and then they produce uranium. It goes into our nuclear stockpile, and we make electricity with it. I'm going to leave you with one last thing before I go on to our discussion points. In 2012, Fukushima happened. I work at a nuclear laboratory. So in about 2000, we decided that I came on to Idaho National Laboratory. Back then we were INEL. Then we went to INEEL, and then things got tough. We had to sell 2 E's, and so now we're INL, right? So we went from a cleanup mission where we were cleaning up the sins of our fathers and mothers in some cases, and we moved into to become a nuclear laboratory. I thought that was the worst decision we'd ever made. I started dusting off my resume, and I'm thinking, there's going to have to be an opportunity for me. I'm going to have to leave the INL at some point because it is just, nuclear is dead. And then in 2012, nuclear was really dead because Fukushima happened. The Europeans started pulling all their nuclear, except France. France was like, bring it on. But the Germans started closing their stuff down. The UK, Japan, everybody was going out of business in the nuclear world. Now here we are today in 2024, whether it was talking about the Biden administration or you're talking about the Trump administration, in their fundamental statement documents on energy, nuclear is well placed in there. We are in the nuclear renaissance, right? Bill Gates' TerraPower is building a new reactor in Wyoming. There's another plan for another reactor by Castro. We just finished Vogtle 1, 2, and 3 in Georgia. How come we're now in a resurgence of nuclear? When I was a kid, people were literally chaining themselves to the fence where they were building reactors, chaining themselves to fences and protesting. No more nuke, right? Big signs everywhere. So what happened? Does anybody know? What happened? Why the big transition?
Climate change became an existential crisis.
That became an issue. And people realized we couldn't wind and we couldn't solar our way out of it, right? It's a good point.
I know for Microsoft, it's a lot of AI data centers take a lot of power, and so they need that.
Yeah, and they don't want to have the carbon liability. I mean, we work with Micron, their data centers, we're looking at reject heat from them. So you're spot on. Even, I always think, even hippies like to drive to concerts, right? And so and cowboys like to drive to country music concerts. You know, we all need to be able to have access to electricity. And we realized as a society, we decided that nuclear was the lesser of all the evils, right? You look at a nuclear power plant, pretty small, pretty compact. You look at a solar array and it's huge. Produce a few megawatts, you can produce 1,000 megawatts of power pretty easily with nuclear. It all became this whole change, right? Nuclear became our friend because it helped us get where we need to go from a climate point of view, and it was firm power. Will we get there with mining? Every time somebody, I usually have my cell phone in my pocket, I put it down here. Every time I have my cell phone in my pocket, I always say, when you buy one of these and you turn on your cell phone and you turn on your iPad and you get into your electric car, there's a poor kid in the Congo not going to school and perhaps even dying so that you can have that, right? It's happening right now as we speak in all these poor countries. You're talking about indigenous peoples being moved off of their properties in Chile and Peru. You're talking about poor people being moved off their properties in Indonesia. It doesn't matter. Every time you take advantage of the technology, you need to be tied back to what's that doing. So if a cell phone turns on in Boise, Idaho, does a poor black kid die in the Congo? And if we as a society are okay with that, then I have to live with that decision. I'm not okay with that. So when you think about these technologies, somewhere there's a hole in the ground. And currently we're simply being metal colonists. We're going right back to the 17 and 1800s where we were colonizing nations. We are going to these nations. We're exploiting because they're too poor to do anything about it. And we're taking advantage of that so we can have the high-end technology that we need. And, you know, I'm not anybody here to preach to you, but I will say that it's incumbent upon us as educated people to be aware of the impact that we have on the world. And if that means that there's going to be a mine in Cobalt, Idaho, to help us provide a secure domestic supply chain, I'm okay with that, as long as we do it right. If it means that that kid can go to school, go read Cobalt Red, go read The War Below, go read The Lithium Economy, go read Chip Wars, go read and study and find out what impact you're having on the world. Because you don't get a get out of jail free card just because you're 5,000 miles displaced from it. And with that, and I never said that I promised you that the end of the talk was you're gonna want to go out and dance in the streets. You may want to drive into a bridge, but it's still, we have some important decisions to make, and I hope we're up to making those decisions. Thanks.
Thank you. So there was a wonderful buzz in this room, and I will just continue with the same energy, but a little bit more channel. So if anybody would like to start, raise your hands. Our speaker is here to answer these questions, and whatever you talked about at your tables, that's fair game to ask, and that will be interesting to hear what we get as a response.
And I will say, I do know how to say, I don't know, right? So I may not know the answer to your question, but we can certainly talk about it.
All right, what hand comes up first? Here's one. Yes, please. Could you please repeat the question?
Mining of the tailings, like the mine tailings?
Yeah, so mine tailings are an interesting problem. In order to dispose of tailings and put them in a place, to take them out of the mine process and put them in a place, you have to have an agreement in place that says you're going to stabilize them and you're going to secure that they don't move and that they're safe from environmental discharge, and that's called the Bevel Act. And so if you go back in there and perturb that tailing pile in any way, you are in violation of the Bevel law, your agreements with the state and your agreements with the federal government. So it's not that you can't go in there, it's that you effectively require federal legislation to enable you to go in there. Now, there was just passed in December what's called the Good Samaritan Mining Act, was just passed in September. 7 sites have been selected. Now, they don't tell what sites they are, but I strongly suspect one of those is the Perpetua project at Stibnite is one of those sites. I would be surprised if it's not. Somebody may have more information. I've been trying to dig into that. That's going to allow 7 demonstrations to be able to go in and remediate old mine sites in the manner that you're talking about. There's not a lot of money. I think there's only like $70 million total. I think there's $10 million for each site, but it's a complicated problem. But essentially, it's a legal agreement that you have if you're going to stack rock somewhere after you process it. There's a federal law that says you stabilized it, you've got it in place. We all look, measured, see. If you muck with that, you're in violation. And so you have to go back through the whole process again, which costs tens of millions of dollars and lots of time to perhaps get a waiver. And if you don't have a guaranteed pathway to funding or way to market. Now, if you could show a company that they were going to make $1 billion by going back in and playing with their tailings, they'd probably be willing to go do it. But this is currently the problem: is it's hard to do, and it all has to do with federal statutes. I hope that answered your question, or at least didn't confuse you more than you were before.
There's 1, 2.
Yeah. I'll let you choose which order.
Good. Here, then over here.
I was just gonna mention, you talked about how they're not gonna make antimony from China anymore.
Yes, sir.
I was gonna ask about the Stibnite mine.
Yeah.
And when they're gonna start that, and if that like made them do that quicker because of that.
Yeah, so so antimony is largely a big deal for the Department of Defense. It's what they use for hardening. In fact, if you go to Perpetua's mine, there's a letter from President Eisenhower when he was the general, written back to the mine site saying, "Thank you for helping us win World War II." So it hardens bullets and penetrators and things like that. But yes, DoD has actually been investing in the Perpetua site, the Stibnite mine, for quite some time. They paid for some drilling that's gone on, and then they're paying for some more investments to help define the magnitude of their resource. So yeah, they've already been in there, and with the announcement by the Chinese in December, it's gonna get more. And stibnite is the only U.S. domestic antimony source. Yeah, so it's a really good question. We think stibnite's in a good place, and my understanding is that they've made some substantial inroads they've had some conflict with tribal entities up there. And you can appreciate why, because it was a mess. But we think stibnite's in a good spot, it has a good feel. And I like the model, right? Not only are we gonna mine, but we're gonna clean up the past and make a pathway for the fish to get where they need to go, and then we're gonna mine as well. So I think stibnite's already invested $10 or $20 million in cleanup. Just to get them to a point where they can't mine, right? All they're doing is being a good neighbor hand so they can produce mine. But yeah, good to know what's in your backyard. It's a pretty part of the world.
Before we go to the next question, stibnite is in central Idaho. Just those who don't know that. Okay, all over there.
So you kind of mentioned that China had like more infrastructure for separating trace metals, and more like for like isolating different types of metals. It kind of seemed to be implied that they were also doing better technologically on that front as well. How much better is China's ability to isolate metals than ours from a technological perspective? And how far behind are we, like, just from a raw knowledge point of view?
It's a really insightful question. It's not one that I get a lot, because I kind of throw a dirty blanket on China, right? I said, oh, they're dirty and they don't, but their new processes that they're developing, when you go into I haven't been to them, but I have friends who've been into them. These things are like going into a micron chip facility. They're clean, the top of the line technology in these separation cycles that they're doing. So not only are they still got some old dirty processes, and they've been cleaning up those, is going to be a nightmare, but their new ventures to help with their integrated supply chain things are state of the art. They're the best in the world. So we are substantially behind. And I would say, when I get in these meetings with my Department of Energy colleagues, and saying, oh, we're going to solve this problem and that problem and this other problem, I tell them we're trying to solve today the problems that China solved a decade ago. Right now, they're in the very same meetings that we're in, talking about what they're going to do for the next 10 years. So we're about a decade behind them, and we're trying to get us to a point where we're equal to where they were in 2012. And they're going to be in 2032, 2034, and we're going to be 10 years behind them still.
Do they have that knowledge like locked up pretty tight? Sorry.
Yeah. Question. Yeah, but we can do that. We have the technologies, and I have a team at the lab. We're doing these advanced separations. They just need to be piloted at scale. We're doing them at bench. They just need to be moved into at scale. And then somebody decides they need to make that there's $1 to be made doing it. In very insightful questions, all of you guys have answered. That's a really good one. We use the idea that they're behind, they're pulling, wicker chairs around town. No. These places are state of the art, and they are producing metals at the lowest cost of anybody in the world.
I've got a question for you. When we're talking about this domestic plant and minerals, I just have a couple of questions here. Because it seems like from your lecture that it's not very profitable to do it here without substance. That's going to have huge pushbacks. We're going to run into the same issues that we've been talking about with rules and regulations. There's also going to be a huge environmental pushback. It seems like there could be other solutions. Like we've already mines elsewhere in the world, and it seems like we are already trying to invest in these places through like defense and whatnot. But we're not actually going in there saying we're going to help build your resources and try to and raise the world standard. Where it seems to be we're relying on, say, the Chinese lowest cost models you projected here. So it seems like this domestic plan feels riddled with holes, just from my observation.
Yeah, well, your observation's pretty well, right? In the absence of a real tractable policy, you have these holes that develop everywhere. So what we tend to do, I have a lot of these things that I've developed, my little statements I've developed over my 37 years of being a geologist, is that the United States never saw a problem they didn't want to study until it became a crisis, right? And that's kind of just the way we do things. It's this haphazard, they come up, it's like I'm probably going to come up with another one of these metaphors, but trying to patch holes in the wall. when a new hole screwed up, you just patch that hole, and then you patch that hole. And instead of fixing the whole wall, that's kind of what our approach is doing. And so we're kind of late to the market. Currently, the State Department has this pivot to Africa mode. China's really moved in on the agriculture side, and the metal side, and other resources side, and exploited those resources. And now, after 15 or 20 years of being out of that place, we're trying to get U.S. capital to flow back in there and get back get ourselves back into the mineral business in China. It's not easy, but I think you make a really clever observation, which is this: we're trying to go back and do what they're doing. Right? That's not a solution. We can't go and go back and do what they're doing. We need to go back and do different, and provide a pathway for education and for raising up the society. I don't know if I answered your question, but I recognize an astute insight into the problem that we have. There are these mines all over the world, and they're there for a reason, and we're not going to change that.
All right.
Did I answer your question at all?
You share my, prompt, and that's enough for me.
Okay, well, if I use enough words, I figure I can confuse the question. I remember what it was.
Take one last question very quickly, please, and then we'll have a quick answer, and then we'll get to the end of class.
I guess it's just personal opinion. Obviously, there's no right or wrong answer that we can probably discern right now. But do you think that if we were to really, really heavily deregulate, just take a chainsaw and cut all the regulations, do you think we could actually compete with China, or do you think we're going to have to implement some sort of protectionism like tariffs and national defense? Like actually identifying China as an adversary, maybe with other countries and such on top of that, in order to actually be competitive and compete with the global market, having stockpiles of materials like, the oil reserves and stuff, having that same thing with metals as well.
Really good. I gotta commend you. What have you done previous for the students? Is they're asking the best questions I've had. So that's a good question. So if you go, remember, you don't mess with the military. So the military has a Defense Production Act, right? That enables them to go do what they want. And if there's a national emergency, they can go do whatever they want. They don't require permits. They don't require, they can go right in and start mining tomorrow. And they did that, right? And during World War II, it was like you couldn't join the military because you had to stay at the mine. They made people mine and they couldn't leave the mine. So yeah, the military has the ability to do that. But I don't think that's where we want to go. Right? That's a bad option, right? To get to the point where we have no other choice but to just go hell bait for leather and do it.
I don't want to wait for wartime to actually start getting metals.
But neither do I. So the streamline the process. That's why this the Good Samaritan Mining Act was passed, as they hoped that they would demonstrate some of these places and show the public that look, we can do it the right way. And then it becomes the model for rapid permitting. Then there was a FAST 41 law that was passed in 2022, which was 41 projects were selected for fast permitting, for streamlined permitting, and that actually worked pretty well. They did pretty well. You can read about that in the war beneath, the war below. I mean, you can read about that about FAST 41. So it's a very good question. It's not, the permitting process isn't so. If you talk to BLM, you look at average time to permit through their process. They're not doing too bad. It's the litigation side of things. So every part of the permit requires. So if you look at time BLM is actually working. So on federal end, BLM is working on it. They're meeting their time requirements. It's the in-between time where the vested parties are litigating every aspect of the permit, which is causing problems. And we can't, in a country of laws, we're not going to get rid of the lawyers. So I think there's a way for the federal government to become more proactive, and we're hoping for some of the things that we're trying to do in socializing the problem with our federal policymakers that we'll get there. So yeah, it's not black or white, but no problem. No question ever is black or white. But I think you're on something. And if we as a society decide this is important enough for us to do, we can develop policies and motivations to do things right. That's my opinion.
We got right to the matter this first day of seminar, so it was pretty full.